I've had it for a number of years. It was made by a friend of mine at the campus ministry that we worked at. Like I said, he's kind of fragile sheep. He's very fragile. We had come up with a slogan a few years ago at campus ministry, which was, and the slogan was, "Black sheep are included." And we had a little cartoon with a sheep on it. And so a friend of mine decided to make sheep. And we had all sorts of different kinds of sheep. And that was we had this table at the student center, and people would come by and could see our sheep and then ask about the story behind that of what was up with that. We used to give them away. So anyways, that little guy goes with me wherever I go in the car. So, and thinking about what makes black sheep different than, of course, other kinds of sheep, or why that slogan meant something was usually, black sheep are the folks who are, well, we had relatives in our family we didn't always talk about. They kind of went off on, they kind of had their own life, and we'd send cards, and that was sufficient. But they weren't a part of the, they might have made their own life choices that kind of didn't make them a part of the rest of the family. The question is but when we were sending this to students, and we said that black sheep are included, I think in this case we were trying to say, even if you don't feel like you're included, you don't feel like you belong in the church, you do, actually. We were trying to think, well, who are the black sheep, and why would college students feel like they were black sheep when it came to the church? And there can be any number of reasons, but what we started to discover was, if you kind of set up enough criteria, we probably all are black sheep in some way or another. We've all, I had questions and doubts in college, and so I felt like I was a black sheep. What would the church have with me with my questions? There are other people who just haven't experienced the church as always a friendly place, and so they don't feel like that they're always welcome. There's any number of reasons. But if you cut it up, there's probably some group that we don't belong to. There's something about us that prevents us from being a part of somebody else's group. And if anybody remembers growing up as a kid, you may remember which groups you were allowed to be a part of and which groups you were forbidden. You were not a part of that group. You may not have been popular enough, or you may have been too popular. It depends. It's amazing how many hierarchies kids have developed, and they all know who's the smart one and who's the dumb one, and who's the athletic one, and popular and unpopular. Got all these different kind of hierarchies, and yet so many that, like I said, we end up being caught into it ourselves. I think that the interesting thing is that a lot of times what makes us black sheep are things that make us unique. And ironically enough, those are usually our gifts. Those are the things. So if we're thinking of the Sunday school lesson, a kid with moral character won't fit into a group of kids who don't, right? And so that it's their character and their strength that makes them different or unique, because they're not going along with the crowd. We all have things that make us different, and people notice that, and that can be a basis of exclusion as well as inclusion, even though it's those very things that we have to offer. If the church or a community or the group of kids, if they knew what kind of gifts our uniqueness could bring. As the video suggested, autism is an example of difference among many differences that exist within our congregation. It's something that can set an individual apart. And that autism is both a limitation, a basis of exclusion, and it can also be a gift. And it's also the kind of the basis of our individuality. And so I think that often, sometimes autism is noticed for the differences it brings, and not always kind of for the gifts that come along with it. So, for instance, it's not uncommon one of the features of autism is kind of closing off the rest of the world. When you get too much stimuli, you're kind of focused on a particular thing. And most of the world is isn't there necessarily, but that focus does amazing things. What kids are able to do with that. One of the more famous people with autism was Temple Grandin, who was I think, a biology professor over at University of Colorado. And she became so fascinated with animals. She would not get her mind off of it. That was her focus. And she started actually imagining what life was like for farm animals. And then she actually started kind of playing around and thinking in ways that nobody ever considered of how you could use, I can't think of the word, but the transportation system that allows farm animals to be sent to the meatpacking place, right? It used to be horribly uncomfortable, lots of stress, but she was able to kind of take on the perspective of these animals. She had so focused on it, and she developed these world-renowned designs. I mean, that's kind of a famous example, but she was thinking of things that nobody else would think of, because that was her focus. It was a limitation, because she wasn't thinking about a lot of the other stuff going on in the world, right? Because she was so focused. But and so she had to deal with those limitations. But she gave us this gift because of that, because she could see things that other people couldn't see, and she could hone in on something where most of us are a little more scattered to be able to do that. And another limitation that is sometimes noticed is not always being able to understand the social cues. We have all these kind of subtle, sounds like a language. We have a verbal language, but then we have our social cues language. And sometimes, and conventions that are unspoken, that everybody should just know what they are. And sometimes that's helpful, but sometimes it's not. It's a limitation, obviously, if a child has autism and can't always understand what those cues might be. But I've experienced and been told, and I've experienced it too, that because of that, they're not concerned about social convention. And so often autistic children are truth tellers. They'll just see, they're not aware they're not supposed to be just observing what they see in front of their own eyes. And they'll just, blurt it out. And that's actually kind of helpful. I mean, it's a helpful reminder of how much, sometimes we don't even have, how much lack of honesty that might exist between us. And then an autistic child can walk in and just name the situation. And so it's a helpful reminder, and it's a strength as well as a limitation. And I think God is able to work through that. God is able to take those gifts that we have, those kind of unique things, in this case a child with autism, and do something with that, like being able to have a truth teller in the group. I'm trying to think of the word here. And having people who are able to kind of think things that other people have not ever thought of before. And that kind of benefits everybody. But I also think that God works through us in relation to difference, so that something is kind of called forth from us. The first time I visited this church, I actually wasn't in the sanctuary, I was in the park, right? And one of the first things I noticed was the high school kids and how they related to Eli, which is to say, they loved him dearly and were protective and just watched out for him. And so I think that was a gift to the high school students that essentially Eli gives to them. And I think God is at work in that as well. And I think that some of the gifts within this congregation, as we think about how we relate to Eli as he grows up, in terms of religious education and support, all these things, we will continue to, as this congregation will continue to learn, and that will be a blessing for the church. And I think also that a lot of the gifts and the possibilities will be developing into the future and can't be determined ahead of time. And so we'll know years later how those gifts come back. I think the interesting thing about the gospel passage through that is that, first of all, we're kind of a couple stories. One is the gospel story that we read. So Jesus is like, not all the sheep are here. I have other sheep. I need to get those sheep as well. I need to bring them in as well. And it kind of is an interesting kind of model, because we think about like who's here today and who is not here. who is able to be included and who is not always able to be included because of the differences that make people who they are. And Jesus says, let's consider, let's remind ourselves there's other sheep. I need to go get them. We need to bring them in because ultimately we want us all to be together. We want to all be able to benefit from each other's gifts. We want to all be able to benefit from the differences that make us who we are. And so Jesus reminds the folks who are here, by the way, I'm going to go and make sure that others are also included. The other story that kind of strikes me as interesting along these lines is the story of Pentecost, which we will be coming to in the next few weeks. There's a lot of elements to this story, but one of the things that caught my imagination was this, that when the disciples started speaking at the birth of the church, they spoke in a way that everybody understood in their own language. It wasn't the case that they all had translators, or that, now we all understand what he's saying, what the disciples are saying in their language, is that everybody heard it in their own tongue. So each one didn't give up their language to hear the gospel. They just heard it in their own way, and it became recognizable. And I think that might be kind of an interesting model, because I think the temptation in running across difference is, well, how do we get, let's say, a child with autism be more like us? Because they'll develop skills, and they will develop skills to be able to relate to a wider society. But of course, it's kind of a two-way street. How do we communicate and do it in such a way that doesn't say, be like us, but rather can allow other people to hear for themselves in their own language and in their own context, be able to hear for themselves the good news of God. Because I think that isn't the miracle of Pentecost. It doesn't happen very often, but that's basically the birth of the church. We all heard it in our own language, in our own way. We didn't give up who we were when we came to faith. And I think the good news in that is that there's kind of a story of grace. I mean, thinking back to growing up as a kid, all those different hierarchies, very, very stressful. If you weren't in the particular right group, and, I can imagine the ways in which one fits in or doesn't fit in can be very stressful for Eli. It can be very stressful for any kid who's grown up. It can be stressful for us, because we know we're accepted by some people, and we know we can't be accepted by other people because we just are who we are. We'll just have people that we know we can talk to, and we have people we know that probably maybe not so much because of who we are as unique people. So we recognize these kind of different hierarchies. And yet, in the stories that we hear in the Gospels, those differences aren't done away with. But they said, but it doesn't matter in terms of your acceptance. We need to bring folks together. Those hierarchies aren't a basis of acceptance or rejection. They're just the unique gifts that people bring that allow people to come together. And so just to get off that kind of, the treadmill or the worry or anxiety that involves us whether I'm accepted or not, and be able to come to the table. The table is actually an apt illustration, right? Everybody comes to the table. It doesn't matter the differences. Those are all brought together. They're not done away with, but they're all brought together. So anybody who feels called by God is able to come to the table. And this kind of, and when we come here, not because we have a particular abilities, particular strengths, even though we do have some, we come to the table even with our limitations. But those limitations and barriers don't prevent us from coming to the table. The communion table is just an expression of the pure graciousness of God. That isn't based on any kind of merit, just based on pure acceptance. And I think that, for me, as I understand the gospel, that might be the good news. The good news of we'll find all the different sheep together, we'll bring them all together, and find in that a kind of acceptance that honors who we are as unique individuals, while not making that a condition of God's grace and acceptance. Amen.